But God also says, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after thy glory hath he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you, for he that touches you touches the apple of his eye." The apple of our eye, the pupil, is the most sensitive part of our body. The apple of God's eye is the Jewish people, and today the nation of Israel. You touch the land of Israel, you will experience consequences, as I will go into detail tonight. This land is not to be divided. It is God's gift to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. But see, God also had planned to bless Ishmael and his offspring. But first of all, we had a little challenge here with Ishmael and his offspring. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Hagar, "Behold, thou art with a child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." The offspring of Ishmael today are fighting in Lebanon, in Iraq, in the Palestinian neighborhoods. Iran and Iraq had a huge war a few years ago, and we have the Shiites and Sunnis fighting today for control of countries throughout the Middle East. They're fighting amongst themselves, but they also have a common enemy in the nation of Israel, the land of Israel, and with the Jewish people. This has been a 3,900 or 3,800 plus year problem, and it still exists. But see, God also blessed Ishmael and the offspring. "And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation." Today, Israel's on half of 1% of the entire Middle East, and these Middle Eastern countries that are offspring of Ishmael control over 90% of the land of the Middle East. They've been blessed with oil and natural gas and resources. They've been blessed with multitudes of people. But that's not enough, because they want the land that Israel occupies as well. They're not satisfied entirely with their blessing. They want Israel's blessing as well. We also have a problem in the church. It's called replacement theology. That's the attitude in the church today, that the church has replaced Israel. The new Israel is the church. The spiritual Israel is the church. If you think this, then you don't see the biblical significance of today's nation of Israel and what God is doing with the nation of Israel. But what happened in the 3rd century, the theologians taught that the Bible's prophetic scriptures were allegorical and not literal. In other words, you could take almost half this Bible out and it's not relevant or not important today if you believe that the prophetic scriptures are allegorical and not literal. But we know we can't take the scriptures out of the book, and we can't add to it. And if we do, there will be great consequences. This is the inerrant word of God from Genesis to Revelation, and it will play out exactly as written. These theologians, they taught that the church was the new Israel, as I just mentioned. But this doctrinal error influenced King Constantine, Augustine, Martin Luther, John Wesley, John Calvin, and many other theologians over the centuries. You'll recognize the Catholic Church here, the Lutheran Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and many other churches today that are from the replacement theology part of the church. This error has led to 18 centuries of Jewish persecution, anti-Semitism, and the death of millions of Jews under the name of Christianity. This has led to some very serious events. But today in America, we have 100 million American church attendees that have no understanding of Bible prophecy and the biblical significance of the nation of Israel. Men that I respect, Chuck Colson, D. James Kennedy's University, Knox Seminary, has written a word saying if we side too much with Israel, we have Palestinian blood in our hands. John Piper, Hank Hanegraaff, and others have said that the nation of Israel today is not biblically significant. It's not a fulfillment of scriptures. Wonderful men, but if you take the scriptures, the prophetic scriptures out of the Bible, you're going to miss the significance of the nation of Israel. This error that I've talked about, this doctrinal error, has led to the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries. The Spanish Inquisition of the 15th century is when the Catholic says, except Christianity or accept Catholicism or leave the country. And it also led to the Holocaust of the 20th century when Adolf Hitler used teachings of Martin Luther, who was furious at the Jews for not responding to his evangelism, and Adolf Hitler used some of Martin Luther's teachings to justify the horrific death of over 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. These church organizations today are calling on Israel to leave Judea, Samaria, the Golan, and Jerusalem, which would put Israel, into indefensible borders. You hear West Bank. The West Bank is Judea and Samaria. Jerusalem, the city of the King of Kings. Jerusalem, the city that Israel has a 3,000 relationship with. Jerusalem, the city that is in the scriptures from the Old Testament and the New Testament 800 times, but not one time in the Quran. The Vatican, the World Council churches, and the National Council churches have been writing the White House and the State Department calling on them, our leaders, to pressure Israel to leave the occupied land. We prefer calling it covenant land. And if these church organizations have been in the proper position, the international community, the world power, the Middle East leaders, the UN, the EU, Russia, and China would not be able to call on Israel to leave this land. What's also interesting is the White House has had a biblical role for a long time, and I think many ways is the reason our nation, the United States, has been blessed. We have blessed Israel in many, many ways, but we have a very interesting history. In my book, Eye to Eye, I went back to 1919 and studied every American president and their position with the Jewish people and the nation of Israel up to the President George W. Bush. Woodrow Wilson favored Israel becoming a state. The Balfour Agreement, the British Balfour Agreement, was an agreement by a Christian, Lord Balfour, that was willing and ready to give land to Israel so they would have their own nation. And over time, Britain would give less and give less and give less, and finally, a small amount of land was given to Israel. But what's important, Woodrow Wilson stood with Israel and their right to become a nation. But here's a couple very interesting situations. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, our president, gave King Saud a letter on Israel's land stating that if Israel ever wanted to become a nation, FDR would immediately contact King Saud and tell him about this. He put it in writing. 1 week later, FDR died. He was replaced by Harry Truman, who made sure Israel became a state, became a nation. John F. Kennedy was concerned about Israel becoming a nuclear power. We had France, we had Russia, we had the United States. And he was very concerned and put a lot of pressure on Israel not to go nuclear. David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister, was under so much pressure, he stepped down, was replaced by Levi Eshkol. And Levi Eshkol said, no, we have the rights to this nuclear facility. We need it for our own protection. He was tough. Kennedy backed off a little bit, but he still was determined to be able to review and watch Israel's nuclear facility. Shortly thereafter, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Don't know who was behind it or what happened, but the fact is, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he was replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who ended up being a great friend of Israel and was the president that armed Israel prior to the Six-Day War. If Israel had not have had the weapons that Lyndon Johnson provided them, they might not have won the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War, a key event in Israel's history. Everybody around the world, a few months and even a year before the Six-Day War, knew that Israel's neighbors were going to attack Israel. Nasser of Egypt talked about driving the Jews of Israel into the soil of Israel. Assad of Syria talked about destroying the Zionist entity and driving them into the Mediterranean. All these Middle East leaders with great bravado talked about how they were going to destroy Israel. And anybody that read the newspaper, watched TV, or listened to the radio knew it was just a matter of time before these countries attacked Israel. They even started moving some of their troops towards the Israeli border, but the Israelis did their homework. Matter of fact, King Hussein from Jordan says Israel knew more about our 34 military facilities in the Middle East than we even knew. Israel also determined it was important for them to put their planes up before the Egyptian pilots finished breakfast. They had a history of eating breakfast at 7 a.m. in the morning, so the Israeli Air Force, all but a few planes, went up, flew over the Mediterranean, flew underneath radar, and took out the entire Egyptian Air Force in 7 different military bases in Egypt. Egypt didn't put a single plane in the sky. And then they gained Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. It was a miraculous victory. The Sinai Desert from Egypt, Judea and Samaria from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, the Wailing Wall, the Temple Mount, now under Jewish control, as well as the city of Jerusalem. But 5 months later, the international community called on Israel to give back the land that they had just obtained in this war of self-defense. Only Israel gets treated like this. UN Resolution 242 passed on November 22nd, 1967, and is the foundation of today's Quartet Roadmap, the nation's plan that has been delivered to Israel for their fulfillment. The UN Security Council called on Israel to return this land they obtained in the war for promises of peace and security. But see, also, every American president since 1967 that got involved in the Land for Peace process, they all experienced personal and political consequences. See, what has happened is every American president, almost every world leader that's ever looked at this problem in the Middle East, has had this vision that they would be the one to bring peace to the Middle East. It's elusive. It's a type of thing that grabs people. They want to be the one to bring peace to the Middle East. But we as believers in Jesus Christ know that peace will not come until Yeshua, Jesus Christ, returns to the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. That's the good news. We will have a short-term covenant, the Daniel 9:27 covenant, but it will give way to the final end-time battles and Jesus Christ return to Jerusalem. Richard Nixon's Land for Peace efforts were stopped by Watergate. Secretary of State Rogers, who was replaced by Henry Kissinger, were very determined on bringing peace to Israel, but Watergate completely stopped Richard Nixon's Land for Peace efforts in Israel. Gerald Ford started the peace process after taking over for Richard Nixon, but Gerald Ford made a couple tactical errors, and he lost the election to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter found a diplomat in Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. He was able to come up with the Camp David Accords that brought the Palestinians into the peace process. After Jimmy Carter's Camp David agreement, we had the highest gas prices in U.S. history, the highest interest rates in U.S. history, an Iran hostage crisis, horrible morale in our military, and one gaffe after another until Jimmy Carter lost in a landslide election to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan used to pass out, a Christian, a wonderful man, used to pass out a brochure in his church in Los Angeles that talked about God's covenant land. Ronald Reagan believed the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation because of the wonderful influence of his mother over him as a child. Ronald Reagan in his second term was coaxed by Secretary of State Shultz, Shimon Peres of Israel, and Arafat to start a peace process in the Middle East, specifically Israel. Reluctantly, Reagan, after he heard the Israelis, after he heard the Palestinians, and after he heard his Secretary of State mention this, he said, okay, let's move forward, and he moved forward cautious. But then the Iran-Contra scandal broke, and it completely stopped Ronald Reagan's peace efforts in its tracks. And then we had George H.W. Bush. President Bush's father had a huge problem in 1991, and that was Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein wanted to gain control of the Kuwaiti oil fields and then Saudi Arabia, and he wanted control over half the world's oil. President Bush's father bringing an ally base to come against Saddam, was told by the Arab leaders, if you want us to join your ally base, we want you, President Bush, to sponsor the Land for Peace conference between Israel and their neighbors after Desert Storm is completed. President Bush, after this success over Saddam, had the highest approval rating in U.S. history as a president. 91% of Americans approved President Bush's handling of the office and the war with Iraq. Incredible numbers. And I'll go into some details here shortly. Ross Perot was in and out of the election and took 19 million votes out of the election. In a lot of ways, cost President Bush's father that election. Bill Clinton had scandal after scandal, and his scandals all broke at the time he was putting the greatest pressure on Israel to leave their land. And George W. Bush wanted to be an education president. He had other plans, but when he got involved in the Land for Peace process, 9/11 came, then the war with Iran and Afghanistan, and his war on terror. And I'll go into more details here shortly. But the bottom line, every one of these presidents have been affected personally and or politically by their involvement in the dividing of the land of Israel. And what I also noticed, and I have documented in my book, that during President Bush and Clinton and Bush's 15 years in office, 14 now, 15, there had been 57 major catastrophes and or political crises during their time of putting pressure on Israel to divide their land. I presented some of those earlier without their names, but the bottom line, these are the largest, most significant record-setting catastrophes in U.S. history that happened the same day or within 24 hours of these presidents applying pressure on Israel to divide their land. As I said earlier, what do these major record-setting events have in common? The 12 costliest hurricanes in U.S. history. What do these major record-setting events have in common? The 10 costliest insurance events in U.S. history. The 3 of the 4 largest tornado outbreaks in U.S. history. And the 2 largest terrorism events in U.S. history both had to do with the World Trade Center. Costliest hurricanes in the United States. Every one of these 11 right here, hurricanes and tropical storms, all have a connection to Israel. You look at these events, you look at the size of the damages to the right, it is incredible. And in my book, I document exactly what was happening at the time of these events. The top 10 catastrophic losses involving insured property. Hurricane Katrina, terrorist attack of 9/11, Hurricane Andrew, Northridge earthquake, Hurricane Charlie, Wilma, Ivan, Rita, Francis, and Hugo. Many of you, even here in New Zealand, have heard of these major events. The 12 costliest hurricanes in U.S. history, every one of these, their connection and what was taking place at the time Israel was being pressured. During President Bush and Bill Clinton's 12 years in office, there were 29 major catastrophic events. 29 events, 12 years. President Bush's first 5 years in office, there have been 28. There have been 28 because President Bush has moved much further into the peace process than any other president. President George W. Bush came up with Palestinian state, a place where Bill Clinton or his father would never dare go. But he moved forward with a Palestinian state of Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security, and he's paid a huge, enormous price. President Bush's father, October 30th through November 1st, 1991, Bush co-sponsored the Madrid Land for Peace Conference with Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. 5 weeks before Madrid, Mikhail Gorbachev had a coup in Russia. They were trying to toss him out of office at the Soviet Union. He beat the coup, was able to get himself to Madrid, Spain, co-sponsored the Madrid Land for Peace Conference, went home, and 5 weeks later the Soviet Union disbanded and his job as president no longer existed, replaced by Boris Yeltsin. At the same time, President Bush was in Madrid, Spain, behind a podium calling on Israel to leave the land that they had obtained in the Six-Day War. A storm that you all are probably familiar with called the perfect storm started developing. They created a book. They created a movie. And this has been on TV and in the motion pictures. It was called The Perfect Storm. This storm developed in the northeast Atlantic. Rather than going from west to east, went from east to west, produced the highest waves in Atlantic Ocean history, 100-foot waves, and was sending 30-foot waves into President Bush's home in Kennebunkport, Maine, as he's calling on Israel to leave their land. We did a special on the 700 Club, and it was incredible, the pictures that we came up. Here's President Bush's summer home in Kennebunkport, Maine, just under $1 million worth of property damage. Here's President Bush right before he leaves Madrid with Gorbachev, and his next photo is walking through his home in Maine, surveying the damage from the perfect storm. Bill Clinton was successful, and right from 12 months to the November election, President Bush's father went from a high approval rating to being out of office. After the Madrid conference, one problem after another problem happened for President Bush. He lost his campaign manager. James Baker took over reluctantly. You might remember he got ill in front of the Prime Minister of Japan. It was one problem, one gaffe, one mistake, and he eventually lost his election by a few votes to Bill Clinton. The torch passed. Clinton took over. Oslo Accords of 9/13/93, the Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty of 10/26, the Y Plantation Agreement. During all of these events, there are major record-setting catastrophes taking place. The odds of these events of this size and magnitude happening at the same time are astronomical. And what I determined too is the greater the pressure on Israel to divide their land, the greater the corresponding catastrophe. The Clinton scandals, Whitewater, the Lewinsky case broke the night he was putting enormous pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to give up more land of Judea and Samaria. It didn't break a week later, a month later, or 2 months later. It broke the same night Netanyahu is in and out of the White House. The transfer of missile technology to China, this was a very huge thing. In May of 1998, this broke at the very time that he was putting pressure. He and Al Gore and Madeleine Albright were pressuring Israel to leave the land. And this technology transfer was on the front page of many newspapers right next to the fact that the Clinton White House was pressuring Netanyahu. And for the next 13 days, the front page news of many newspapers around the country was the missile technology scandal and the pressure the White House was applying on Israel at that time. And then the summer of 2000, July 2000, Yasser Arafat was offered 95% of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, a portion of Jerusalem, all these incredible offers, even willing to discuss the future of the Temple Mount. 95% of what Arafat wanted, and he turned it down. And the only reason Ehud Barak offered this because Bill Clinton and James Carville helped get Ehud Barak elected. And then George W. Bush, staggering catastrophic losses. Now, here is some incredible numbers. 1996 through 2000, there was $33 billion in property damage. This is this is insured catastrophic losses. From 2001, when President Bush took office, to 2005, there has been $129.4 billion in insured losses. That doesn't count the U.S. total of $120 billion that the U.S. appropriated for Katrina. These numbers are staggering. This is another example of the seriousness of these times and the seriousness of what President George W. Bush is doing right now with the land of Israel. 2001, President Bush took office, and he did not want to be a participant in the Israeli-Palestinian process, only a facilitator. He wanted to be the education president. He wanted to make sure that no child would be left behind. He wanted to make sure there was a kinder, gentler tone in Washington, D.C. He had big plans, and I can tell you his first 75 days could not have gone smoother for him. He had a wonderful cabinet. Sally Quinn of a left-leaning newspaper, the Washington Post, said President Bush has the best administration cabinet in over 100 years. That's a lot from the Washington Post. He had big plans, huge plans, and everything politically was going well for him in a good, solid cabinet. But then, April 2001, Mubarak of Egypt and Abdullah from Jordan talked to him and convinced him that he needed to get involved in the Land for Peace process. He reluctantly became involved, and then the problems began. 17 days prior to 9/11, President Bush, Crown Prince Abdullah from Saudi Arabia, Prince Bandar from Saudi Arabia, Colin Powell, and our U.S. ambassador to Israel were negotiating what was going to be the most comprehensive address ever given to the UN General Assembly on the land of Israel. It was supposed to be given on 9/24. This 17 days of work was stopped on 9/10. Bandar was excited. They'd worked around the clock. They'd worked out their differences, and President Bush was going to call on Israel to fulfill the UN Resolution 242. He was going to call on Israel to negotiate the future boundaries of Jerusalem in the final status talks, and he was going to call for a Palestinian state. His dad would never go there, and either would Bill Clinton. The God of Israel did not produce the evil of 9/11, but the God of Israel has been our security for a very long time in the United States. The God of Israel did not restrain the tragedy of 9/11. The 9/11 events has led to a $1 trillion plus war on terror. It's cost the United States $500 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been a very expensive thing for President Bush politically. It has led to him losing both parties, his Republican control of the U.S. House and the Senate. It's created problem after problem after problem for him. He had it going for him, but when he crossed the line and became involved in the dividing of the land of Israel, things changed. President Bush sincerely wants to see Israel live in peace and security. I believe that. But you're not to give up the land that God intended for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. June 24, 2002, President Bush finally gave his commitment, personal commitment, to Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. The Bush plan got merged into the Quartet plan later that summer, and it became officially approved on December 20th, 2002 at the White House. But finally, the Quartet Peace Plan was delivered on April 30th, 2003. The United States, the EU, the UN, and Russia gave Israel and gave the Palestinians the plan on how Israel was to divide their land. This was a three-phase plan. No phase has been fulfilled yet because of the Palestinians, but the United States and the international community continues to work with them. The day after the Quartet Roadmap was delivered was the beginning of the biggest tornado outbreak in U.S. history. Tornadoes tore their way across Kentucky and Illinois early on Mother's Day 2003 as they continued. A record-breaking count of 434 tornadoes were sighted during the first 10 days of May. This was in the heartland of America, the Midwest, as the heartland of Israel is being negotiated. What's amazing about this event, this was also the beginning of some horrific weather from Europe. Most of these events have happened in the United States because we have been the one that's been applying pressure. But what happened is also that first week of May, Europe and Russia began experiencing some of the hottest temperatures in history, broke 500 years of temperatures records. Created floods and fires and massive lightning storms. I looked on the internet one night and 95% of France had lightning storms. And for the rest of the summer and into the mid-August, it was horrific weather in Europe, horrific weather in the United States. And the meteorologists said, we never saw this coming. There was no warning. They said, we'll be studying this for many, many years. And it began the first week in May when Javier Solana specifically told the world this wasn't just the Bush plan, this was also the EU's plan. That first week of May, Colin Powell after the roadmap was delivered. He was in Israel. He met with the head of Syria, talking on Israel, leaving the Golan Heights. One of the State Department officials blamed Christian fundamentalists, Christian Zionists, for the reason these things were happening. President Bush was giving a commencement address at the University of South Carolina, stating specifically that these things must happen. We must move forward. The events must happen. The roadmap must be delivered. The roadmap must be fulfilled, because that will fulfill his personal commitment to Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. Major hurricanes, 2004, Hurricane Charlie, hurricane moving up the Gulf of Mexico, up towards Tampa and St. Petersburg. Daniel Kurtzer is over in Israel, putting pressure on Israel to leave these unauthorized settlements. President Bush had a couple months left before the election. He wanted to have a victory because it expended so much political capital in Israel. So he had his Israeli ambassador putting pressure on Israel to leave unauthorized settlements. Unauthorized settlements in Israel are settlements that have not been approved by the Israeli government because of pressure by the United States and the international community. A majority of unauthorized settlements in Israel are settlers, Israelis that have been led to move back to the covenant land of Israel. They live in trailers and mobile homes. Hurricane Charlie was working its way up the Gulf, and all of a sudden made a 90-degree turn, went right into Punta Gorda, Florida, and went right into Polk County, Florida, and hit the county in Florida that had more mobile homes and trailers than any other county, wiped out 3,500 trailers, and heavily damaged 7,000 others. Fortunately, very little loss of life. But I've watched this over and over again. If you touch the apple of God's eye, if you put his people in risk, if you put them in indefensible borders, if you empower the terrorists that are determined to destroy Israel, you too will suffer the consequences. And that's what has happened in the United States. Hurricane Francis, 48 hours before President Bush was going to accept the nomination for his Republican Party for president for his second term, Ariel Sharon did him a favor and said, we're going to accelerate our evacuation of settlements as a gift to President Bush. Immediately after Sharon said that, Hurricane Francis became the size of Texas. It was massive in size. It became a Category 5 hurricane and completely knocked off President Bush's acceptance speech off the front page of the newspapers. Completely. No pun intended. It happened, and it was significant because this was one of the biggest hurricanes in history, and ironically, the size of Texas. President Bush's brother could not even go to the Republican convention because this massive hurricane was coming toward his state, Florida, and he'd called for an evacuation of 3 million people from their homes in southern Florida. Hurricane Ivan, same thing again. We're pressuring Israel on the settlements. Came ashore on Rosh Hashanah. Hurricane Jean, 9/21. President Bush is at the UN General Assembly to tell the world community his foreign policy plan a couple months before the election. This was a major speech at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on 9/21. President Bush said Israel must freeze settlement construction. Israel must leave unauthorized settlements. Israel must negotiate in good faith. Israel must not humiliate the Palestinians, and the Palestinians must stop the terror. I told my wife, Claudia, let's watch what happens with Hurricane Jean. This storm had been traveling around for a couple weeks, moving its way to the northeast Atlantic, was dissipating and dying, and as soon as President Bush spoke those words in New York City, I have all the National Hurricane Center reports, that storm gained strength, regained massive strength, went south, went southeast, went southwest, and went all the way west back to Florida. Ended up producing $7 billion in property damage. When President Bush spoke those words, that storm regained strength and came back to Florida. It's hard sometimes to explain these things, but when you look at it over and over again, when you see them in PowerPoints, when you see these storms, it is incredible. President Bush's brother state was pummeled, record-setting U.S. evacuations, as we're calling on Israel to leave unauthorized settlements. See, the God of Israel does not look at these settlements as being occupied. He's authorized them. He's authorized Jews to live on this land. He's put it on their hearts to move back to Israel because he has a redemptive plan for the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. U.S. government's $12.8 billion appropriation in 42 days. U.S. insurance company losses were $25 billion. Uninsured losses were $20 billion. We've never had a period of 8 weeks like that, 42 days like this in history. 4 record-setting hurricanes, all within 42 days, just under $60 billion worth of property damage, all with a connection to Israel. Florida agricultural loss reached $3 billion, and the combined Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean damaged more than one of every 5 homes in Florida. President Bush's brother was devastated. It was one event after another. But the event that many Jews and Christians around the world were praying about was the expected disengagement of Gaza and northern Samaria. Ariel Sharon, under enormous pressure to put the roadmap in place, decided for a unilateral evacuation of Gaza and northern Samaria, and for 7 days, Israel was forcing their people out of their homes, out of their offices, out of their businesses, and out of their synagogues. 1,700 media people from around the world came to cover this event. It was very significant because every year we might have 2 or 3 major events that the entire world watches. That year it was the Pope's funeral in April. Over 2 billion people around the world watched that. And then now the world, over 1.7 billion people, watch Jew, Israeli soldier walking side by side, arm in arm with settlers, both in tears, as they're being forced from their homes to appease the international community. August 23rd, the evacuations were completed, their evictions completed. Authorities used force at times on Tuesday, August 23rd, to clear the 2 remaining West Bank settlements in Hamash and Sanur. General Dan Hulitz said, "Today we accomplished the first phase of the disengagement process related to the evacuation of civilians, and the Israeli forces plan to remove the settlers' belongings, destroy their houses, and withdraw from Gaza." August 23rd. That afternoon, President Bush stated, "I want to congratulate Prime Minister Sharon for having made a very tough decision. As I said in my remarks yesterday in Salt Lake City, the Prime Minister made a courageous decision to withdraw from Gaza." President Bush continued stating, "This is a very hopeful period. Again, I applaud Prime Minister Sharon for making a decision that has really changed the dynamics on the ground and has really provided hope for the Palestinian people. My vision, my hope is that one day we will see 2 states, 2 democratic states, living side by side in peace and security." This was the afternoon of August 23rd, 2005. A few hours later, Tropical Depression 12 forms near the Bahamas out of nowhere. Within 24 hours, in less than 24 hours, the newly formed Tropical Depression was upgraded to Tropical Storm Katrina on Wednesday, August 24th by 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Tropical Storm Katrina became Hurricane Katrina the next day. Hurricane Katrina came ashore in southeast Florida Friday afternoon, and Hurricane Katrina became a fierce and enormous Category 4 hurricane, pummeling Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama on August 29, devastating the city of New Orleans, the largest disaster in U.S. history, affecting an area the size of Britain. We have never had anything like this hit our country. The size was enormous. The intensity was enormous. It came right on the heels of the final Jews being forced from their home. The parallels in Israel and the parallels with what was happening in New Orleans and throughout the Gulf Coast was amazing. Evacuees and refugees being forced from their home in Gaza. Evacuees and refugees being forced from their home in New Orleans. Buses taking evacuees out of their home in Gaza to tents, into parks, and to hotel rooms. The same thing in Louisiana. Over and over, the parallels continued. We had the military come into Gaza to force the Jews out of their homes. The military moved in to Gaza to force the Jews out of their home. 2,700 homes and businesses destroyed in Gaza, 225,000 homes and businesses destroyed in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. President Bush's home state took a majority of these evacuees. 32 straight days, the newspapers in Washington, D.C., the front page story was the devastation of Katrina. 17 days prior to Katrina, the front page news of our newspapers in Washington was the coming evacuation of Jews from their home in Gaza and northern Samaria. The parallels continue and continued and continued. President Bush has been to New Orleans 13 times now to survey this damage. And one lady that's at the White House is not a believer said Hurricane Katrina had completely disrupted President Bush's administration. It was that big. 3 record-setting Category 5 hurricanes in the next 8 weeks. Each one of these had a connection to U.S. pressure on Israel. Hurricane Katrina was the 6th most intense hurricane in Atlantic basin history. Rita was the 4th most intense hurricane in Atlantic basin history. And Wilma was the most intense hurricane in Atlantic basin history. All within a period of 8 weeks. President Bush's brother state pummeled once again. A majority, about 95% of their hurricanes hit Florida. Record-setting U.S. evacuations in Texas and Louisiana. U.S. government appropriations, $116.7 billion for Katrina, 10 days after Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. Insured losses at $45 billion for Katrina, $12 billion losses for Rita, and $14 billion for Hurricane Wilma. Hurricane Rita intensified to a Category 5 hurricane as King Abdullah from Jordan was in the White House strategizing with President Bush on the next step after Israel's evacuation. Hurricane Wilma happened and became the most intense hurricane in Atlantic Basin history the same morning that Condoleezza Rice told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, "We are stopping settlement funding. We're stopping sending money to Israel because of settlement construction." Not a week later, not a month later, not 6 months later, the same day. And the next day, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas was at the White House to discuss with President Bush the next step in President Bush's vision, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. People throughout the world were amazed at what was happening in the United States, especially Katrina. World leaders around the world sent their condolences, and none of them could believe that this happened in the United States because we don't have events like this. We're the ones always helping other countries around the world with funds and resources and people. They were blown away by what had happened on the Gulf Coast. President Bush, 2006. My wife and I had been praying for the perfect time to give our book. I had written in the back of my book, I have 4 letters to President Bush. I talked to him through letters. He was aware of our position. We got 2 letters back from him. And we prayed, Lord, when do we give this book? I'd had another book. When do we give this book to President Bush? The day after Katrina, the Lord says, now is the time to deliver eye to the president. Within 72 hours, President Bush received his copy of Eye to Eye with more documentation. A couple days later, I got a letter from Karl Rove, his top counselor in the White House. The next day, I got a letter from Vice President Cheney. And the next time I was in front of President Bush at a press briefing, I could tell that he'd received his copy based on the nonverbals. And about a week after that, a businessman in Minneapolis walked up to President Bush at a fundraiser and put Eye to Eye right in his hand and said, President Bush, you've got to read this book. I think in the beginning, President Bush didn't fully understand that there was a significance of dividing the land. But 2006, he stood with Israel over and over again. He would not accept or fund Ehud Olmert's realignment plan. He stated the U.S. will defend Israel in the event of a war with Iran. He stated Israel does not have to negotiate with Hamas. He stated Israel has a right to defend herself in the war against Hezbollah, and that he wouldn't pressure Israel to stop the war with Hezbollah. Within 24 hours of the beginning of Israel's war with Hezbollah, 4 top Saudis were in the White House on a Sunday talking to President Bush about doing more. In the past, President Bush would have done something quickly, as he did with Crown Prince Abdullah in 2001, but he stood strong. He accelerated the delivery of bunker-busting bombs and smart bombs to Israel during their war with Hezbollah. He and the quartet gave the Palestinians 3 conditions of moving into the roadmap talks for the Palestinians: to renounce violence, to recognize Israel's right to exist, and abide by past Israeli-Palestinian accords. This is virtually impossible for the Palestinians to agree to. President Bush has done some activity through Condoleezza Rice primarily because he needs the international community backing of his problems in Iraq. But what's been interesting in the past, when President Bush has problems with Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, it's always when he and his administration are the most active in the peace process or in the peace talks. But President Bush stood strong. The 2006 tropical storm and hurricane season was going to be another massive season. You know, we've always had tropical storms and hurricanes. We've had it for history, but I've studied every billion-dollar event in America, and 85% of them have a direct connection to Israel, and that's adjusted to $2,005. There are always going to be these events, but we've had so much more intensity as we've put more pressure on Israel. And 2006 was supposed to be another enormous season, but it didn't happen. The number of named storms in 2006 was 9. The number of named storms predicted May 31st by a team at Colorado State University, led by Professor William Gray, the National Hurricane Center, and AccuWeather, was 17. We were supposed to have 3 major hurricanes that summer, like Category 4, Category 5. The wind speed when Tropical Storm Alberto hit the Florida Panhandle near the Adams Beach on June 13 was the strongest winds Florida experienced the entire season. 45-mile-an-hour winds. Property damage, it was $200 billion in 2005, was $100 million in 2006. The number of storms that formed in October, the first time since 2002 that no storms formed that month, was 0. Also, no Category 4 or 5 storms formed this year for the first time since 1997. The season didn't happen. But President Bush is under a lot of pressure right now because the world community believes that this tiny little nation that's half of 1% of the land of the Middle East, that's the size of the state of New Jersey, is the key to peace throughout the Middle East and the key to peace throughout the world. These groups and people believe that Israel is the key to world peace. UN leaders, EU officials, Blair, Putin, Chirac, Merkel, and others. Protestant church leaders from the replacement theology part of the church, Catholic church leaders, U.S. State Department officials. But we know Jesus Christ returns to Jerusalem to begin his 1,000-year millennial reign. That's when we will have lasting peace. The key to improved U.S.-Muslim relations in the Middle East and around the world is an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. Condoleezza Rice, Karen Hughes, Laura Bush, James Baker III, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and King Abdullah of Jordan all are saying to President Bush monthly, you have to do more to get a peace deal out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian peace key is the key to a peaceful Middle East. Blair, Merkel, Chirac, Solana, the new UN Secretary General, King Abdullah, and King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. Key to world peace and key to Middle East peace, these same leaders. These will be the 4 main themes for 2007. U.S. policy regarding the Middle East is hurting the U.S.'s ability to lead a coalition in Iraq, a great concern to the United States. It's spending an absolute fortune in Iraq. Addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would provide much-needed credibility for the U.S. in the Arab world. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the number one geopolitical problem in the world and key to bringing peace to the Middle East and the world, according to Tony Blair. And the U.S. and the world community believes it is a time to revive talks on a two-state solution in Israel. These are what we're hearing the first 2 months of this year from the world leaders. We're also hearing from the UN, the EU, and Russia that they are expecting Israel to make peace with the Palestinians and the Syrians. To make peace, that requires giving up land. That requires giving up biblical heartland. That requires giving up East Jerusalem. That talks about giving land up that would put them in indefensible borders. The nation leaders want East Jerusalem to be the capital of Palestine. We hear this over and over again. The 2007 peace participants, and these are the people we're watching very carefully and watch what they have to say. Condoleezza Rice, Zbigniew Livni, Andrea Merkel, George Bush, Tony Blair, Ehud Olmert, Abbas, Abdullah, and Mubarak. These are the ones that are involved in the process. The problem is the Palestinians aren't cooperating. The Palestinians don't acknowledge Israel's right to exist. They said last week they might. They don't acknowledge these resolutions. But the Bible said, "In that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it." It's going to come down to the city of Jerusalem. Also in Zechariah 12:9, "It shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem." God will bring them against Jerusalem. And the final battle, the battle of Armageddon, which is the battle of Jerusalem, will be at the time Jesus Christ returns to be victorious and to begin his reign. A couple important quotes here, and then I'll show you what's happened here in the last couple weeks. And my wife will have a prayer for you. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is important to have and is important to be solved. This is President Bush, and he said, "I am committed to a two-state solution." He believes it is in Israel's interest and the Palestinian people's interest to have two states living side by side for peace. And he said this because of all the international players that are continuing to ask him to do more. This is on 12/7. Tony Blair said the same day, "It's important that we do everything we can in the wider Middle East to bring about peace between Israel and the Palestinians. This is something that I know you, President Bush, feel deeply and passionate about. You are the first president who committed yourself to the two-state solution, and I believe that by moving this forward, we send a very strong signal, not just to the region, but to the whole of the world, that we are even-handed and just in the application of our values, and that we want to see Israel confident of its security and Palestinian people able to live in peace and justice and democracy." I'm working on tying all this together. Tony Blair. Tony Blair has had problems since 2001, and I have almost all of them matched to what he has stated and what he has done to Israel. I will have it done in a couple weeks. This day, 12/7, London was hit with rare tornadoes. 7/7/2005, Tony Blair was in Glen Eagles, Scotland, about ready to give $3 billion for the G8 to the Palestinians for aid. He was going to announce it on 7/7/2005, and 4 suicide bombings happened in the London rail system. It shut the city down. He had to leave Glen Eagles to go survey the damage in London. The next day, he gave the presentation that we're giving $3 billion to the Palestinians. Most of Tony Blair's problems have a direct connection to Israel. And we're going to be watching Andrea Merkel very closely as well. Condoleezza Rice stated at the end of last year there would be no greater legacy for the Bush administration than a Palestinian state living next to Israel in peace and security. And I read just the other day in a Haaretz Israeli newspaper that Condoleezza Rice is very committed to seeing a Palestinian state, and she even compares some of what she's seeing in Israel amongst the Palestinians to what she saw growing up in the southern U.S. There's big differences, but for some reason this brilliant, tactful, unflappable lady does not see what is happening for what it is. At the Vatican on January 1st, Pope Benedict prayed for peace in the Middle East, asking that people work courageously toward an end to the Holy Land's conflict. In other words, Israel, give up the land. Palestinians, make sure they live in peace. South Korean Ban Ki-moon, the new Secretary General, said that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the core of the solution to all of the problems in the Middle East. This is our new Secretary General. If the issues with the conflicts between Israel and Palestine go well, resolutions of other issues in the Middle East, including Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, are likely to follow suit. Incredible. This is the UN's new leader. President Bush was with Andrea Merkel at the White House on January 4th. I was right there, right in front of them, and watching them focus on this Israeli-Palestinian issue. President Bush said, and Madam Chancellor had a good idea to convene the quartet, which I agreed to. She's now ahead of the EU for 6 months. This rotating presidency of the EU, Germany is right now the president for 6 months, and Andrea Merkel has been pushing more quartet meetings and a solution. President Bush said, I think the quartet ought to meet at an appropriate time. Condoleezza Rice will be going to the Middle East here shortly. She'll come back to report to not only me, but also to the Chancellor, Merkel, about how we can move the process forward. We're committed strongly to a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace. Two democracies supporting each other's rights to exist. President Bush said he was optimistic that we can achieve that objective. I'm looking forward to working with the Chancellor to do so. President Bush needs Andrea Merkel's help in Iraq. Condoleezza Rice headed to Israel. This was the beginning of our first billion-dollar weather-related event since 2005. U.S. ice storms begin as Rice is landing in the Middle East. Her first meeting is with Foreign Minister Livni. And this is what Condoleezza Rice stated. We continue to support the roadmap as a reliable guide to the President's two-state vision. In fact, the vision now of all who are signed on to it. One of the great values of the roadmap is that it has international support. It is a quartet's document, it's Israel's document, it's the Palestinians' document. And it has, therefore, I think, a very important function. See, the United States is saying this is everybody's plan now. They're pushing it over. At the same time, the United States Midwest was blanketed by a record ice storm. Almost 17 states were paralyzed by a massive ice storm and snowstorm as Rice is in Israel talking about giving this land up. The next day, Rice meets with Abbas. She said, I came here to Ramallah, so I'm going around the Middle East to say to everyone that the United States is deeply committed to finding maps to accelerate progress in the roadmap. The roadmap, after all, is the internationally recognized guide to the establishment of a two-state solution, and we should fulfill all of the terms. Every place she went, she stated this. Dallas, Texas was hit with a massive ice storm. They were hit with 2 major ice storms in 72 hours. It shut down a majority of the state. The state of Missouri was shut down. The state of Oklahoma, schools were shut for a week. As she's traveling from country to country to country in the Middle East, espousing the benefit of a Palestinian state. Monday, January 15th, Rice meets with the Egyptian foreign minister. She says, we also have an opportunity to talk about the recent discussions that I had in Israel and the Palestinian territories that we hope will lead to further work on a political horizon for the Palestinian people, ultimately to the establishment of a Palestinian state. I think that our conversations about this were rich. Mubarak says Egypt has a proposed new Mideast plan and is going to work with the quartet. He met with Condoleezza Rice as well. At the time, Condoleezza Rice is in Egypt. 75% of California's orange and lemon crops were devastated by 2 days of freezing weather, over $1 billion in property damage. Condoleezza Rice heads to Saudi Arabia. Same statements again. I said to His Royal Highness that the U.S. would deepen its involvement in the efforts to find a peace between the Palestinians and Israelis so that the President's vision of 2 states living side by side in peace and security could be realized. Then she heads to Kuwait, January 16th, meets with the Sheikh Sabah al-Hamid, in the Emir of Kuwait, and so we will work hard and we will certainly hope for the establishment of a Palestinian state. Then she heads to Germany, and this is an amazing 48 hours. She meets with German Foreign Minister Steinmeier. I do look forward to inviting the members of the quartet to Washington, and so I look forward to that meeting as we re-energize the quartet in its efforts to support the progress in the Middle East that could lead to a two-state solution and Israel a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace, democracy, and freedom. The same day, California is hit by these massive storms, massive ice storms. It paralyzes a large part of the state. So we had 7 days of horrible weather as Rice is over there going from state to state talking about a Palestinian state. Then she heads to Germany. As she's in Germany, the next day she meets with Angela Merkel, and their purpose and desire is to revive the Middle East peace talks. Rice meets with Angela Merkel. She says, we have the impression there is a movement on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have a common political interest in finding a solution to this conflict, and the European Union would like to make a contribution. This is Angela Merkel speaking. Within the framework of the quartet, we know that resolving this conflict, or at least making a progress, would also have an effect on all the other regional conflicts. Rice cuts her visit to Berlin short in order to leave before hurricane-force winds worsened. She had to get out of Dodge, in other words, as they say in Texas. Hurricane-force winds and heavy downpours hammered northern Europe. The storms were among the fiercest to batter northern Europe in years. As she is in Germany, winds up to 133 miles per hour swept off the Atlantic and cut a swath from Britain, northern France, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Poland, Belgium, the Czech Republic, and into Russia, the EU and Russia. Here's pictures. More than 200 flights in and out of Frankfurt were canceled because of the winds. German meteorologists record gusts up to 125 miles per hour, actually 133. Hans-Georg Zimmermann, spokesman for Deutsche Bahn, the train system in Germany, says we are at a standstill nationwide with only a few trains running. Again, not weeks, not months, not years after. At the time, Rice and Merkel are talking about dividing the land of Israel. Hartmut Medorn, chief executive of Deutsche Bahn, says we have never yet had such a situation in Germany. Rice gets out of Berlin, heads to London. The weather, the winds are incredible. She circles Heathrow. They advised to leave. I talked to a friend that was on that flight. They wanted her to leave, but she said, no, I've got to get into London. She had to meet with Blair. And for you pilots, landing in 80-mile-an-hour winds in London's Heathrow Airport is one difficult task. I talked to a 757 pilot, and he said 25 to 35-mile-an-hour crosswind knots, we don't land. 80-mile-an-hour knots, on her way to meet with Tony Blair. Rice meets with Blair to discuss her trip to Israel. Blair says the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, once again, is the #1 geopolitical problem in the world. Traffic on the Eurostar, the train service that runs under the English Channel and connects London and Paris, was suspended for 90 minutes after an electrical cable holder was blown onto the tracks near the city of Lille in France. The London rail shut down due to high winds and its disruption. Winds topped out at 125 miles per hour in northern Britain, and Heathrow canceled over 280 flights because of the massive winds. Ferries canceled or delayed in Britain, Ireland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Finland, and trains delayed in Netherlands, Germany, and Austria, as I mentioned. Conclusion. The covenant land of Israel was a gift by God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. No one has the rights, as you all have seen tonight. No Israeli prime minister, and I didn't cover tonight, but every Israeli prime minister that's been involved in this has lost his government or had a tragic end. Every Middle East leader that's been involved in the dividing of the land has had heart attacks, lymph cancer, assassination. In Saddam Hussein's situation, hung. And according to a former White House speechwriter, Yasser Arafat died of AIDS. Every one of the Middle East leaders that attempted to conquer or divide the land of Israel had a horrific end to life. And as I shared tonight, every American president that's been involved in dividing the land has paid a very significant price. But we know that these events must happen to bring the prophetic scriptures together. We're watching the city of Jerusalem with great interest. We're watching Russia and Iran and China cooperate. These are key countries to watch. Also Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the Israeli prime ministers, the U.S. presidents, and the UN and EU officials. You watch this small group of people and watch what they say about the covenant land of Israel. You will see some incredible events take place. Many of us prayed that Israel would not be forced to leave Gaza and northern Samaria, but the Lord showed me right before that it was going to happen. There would still be consequences, but these things are necessary prior to Jesus Christ's return. We have seen prophetically significant events accelerate in the past 30 months, with an even greater acceleration following the Gaza and Samaria evictions. We could have never predicted what happened in 2006 in Israel. And look what's happening in 2007. We have so many balls in the air right now, we don't know how they're going to play, and they don't know how they're going to fall. But we are literally living in the most important time in Bible prophecy history. We are watching the scriptures that were written 2,500 plus years ago play out right before our eyes. We are blessed. The good news is Yeshua, Jesus Christ, is returning soon to Jerusalem. Hallelujah.